Chapter 2 of Ayesha, The Return of She. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lars Rolander. Ayesha, The Return of She by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 2. The Lamasery. 16 years had passed since that night vigil in the old Cumberland house, and behold, we two, Leo and I, were still travelling, still searching for that mountain peak shaped like the symbol of life which never, never could be found. Our adventures would fill volumes, but of what use is it to record them? Many of a similar nature are already written of in books. Those that we endured were more prolonged, that is all. 5 years we spent in Tibet, for the most part as guests of various monasteries, where we studied the law and traditions of the Lamas. Here we were once sentenced to death in punishment for having visited a forbidden city, but escaped through the kindness of a Chinese official. Leaving Tibet, we wandered east and west and north thousands and thousands of miles, sojourning amongst many tribes in Chinese territory and elsewhere, learning many tongues, enduring much hardship. Thus we would hear a legend of a place, say 900 miles away, and spend 2 years in reaching it, to find when we came there, nothing. And so the time went on. Yet never once did we think of giving up the quest and returning, since before we started we had sworn an oath that we would achieve or die. Indeed, we ought to have died a score of times, yet always were preserved, most mysteriously preserved. Now we were in country where, so far as I could learn, no European had ever set a foot. In a part of the vast land called Turkestan there is a great lake named Balkhash, of which we visited the shores. 200 miles or so to the westward is a range of mighty mountains marked on the map as Arkati Tau, on which we spent a year, and 500 or so to the eastward are other mountains called Cherga, whither we journeyed at last, having explored the triple ranges of the Tau. Here it was that at last our true adventures began. On one of the spurs of these awful Cherga mountains, it is unmarked on any map, we well nigh perished of starvation. The winter was coming on and we could find no game. The last traveller we had met hundreds of miles south told us that on the range was a monastery inhabited by Lamas of surpassing holiness. He said that they dwelt in this wild land over which no power claimed dominion and where no tribes lived, to acquire merit with no other company than that of their own pious contemplations. We did not believe in its existence, still we were searching for that monastery, driven onward by the blind fatalism which was our only guide through all these endless wanderings. As we were starving and could find no argals, that is fuel with which to make a fire, we walked all night by the light of the moon, driving between us a single yak, for now we had no attendant, the last having died a year before. He was a noble beast, that yak, and had the best constitution of any animal I ever knew, though now, like his masters, he was near his end. Not that he was overladen, for a few rifle cartridges, about 150, the remnant of a store which we had fortunately been able to buy from a caravan 2 years before, some money in gold and silver, a little tea and a bundle of skin rugs and sheepskin garments were his burden. On we trudged across the plateau of snow, having the great mountains on our right, till at length the yak gave a sigh and stopped. So we stopped also, because we must, and wrapping ourselves in the skin rugs sat down in the snow to wait for daylight. "We shall have to kill him and eat his flesh raw," I said, patting the poor yak that lay patiently at our side. "Perhaps we may find game in the morning," answered Leo, still hopeful, "and perhaps we may not, in which case we must die." "Very good," he replied, "then let us die. It is the last resource of failure. We shall have done our best." "Certainly, Leo, we shall have done our best. If 16 years of tramping over mountains and through eternal snows in pursuit of a dream of the night can be called best." "You know what I believe," he answered stubbornly, and there was silence between us, for here arguments did not avail. Also, even then I could not think that all our toils and sufferings would be in vain. The dawn came, and by its light we looked at one another anxiously, each of us desiring to see what strength was left in his companion. Wild creatures we should have seemed to the eyes of any civilised person. Leo was now over 40 years of age, and certainly his maturity had fulfilled the promise of his youth, for a more magnificent man I never knew. Very tall, although he seemed spare to the eye, his girth matched his height, and those many years of desert life had turned his muscles to steel. His hair had grown long, like my own, for it was a protection from sun and cold, and hung upon his neck, a curling, golden mane, as his great beard hung upon his breast, spreading outwards almost to the massive shoulders. The face too, what could be seen of it, was beautiful though burnt brown with weather, refined and full of thought, sombre almost, and in it, clear as crystal, steady as stars, shone his large grey eyes. And I was what I have always been, ugly and hirsute, iron grey now also, but in spite of my 60 odd years, still wonderfully strong, for my strength seemed to increase with time and my health was perfect. In fact, during all this period of rough travels, although now and again we had met with accidents which laid us up for a while, neither of us had known a day of sickness. Hardships seemed to have turned our constitutions to iron and made them impervious to every human ailment. Or was this because we alone amongst living men had once inhaled the breath of the essence of life? Our fears relieved, for notwithstanding our foodless night, as yet neither of us showed any sign of exhaustion, we turned to contemplate the landscape. At our feet beyond, a little belt of fertile soil, began a great desert of the sort with which we were familiar, sandy, salt encrusted, treeless, waterless, and here and there streaked with the first snows of winter. Beyond it, 80 or 100 miles away, in that lucent atmosphere, it was impossible to say how far exactly, rose more mountains, a veritable sea of them, of which the white peaks soared upwards by scores. As the golden rays of the rising sun touched their snows to splendour, I saw Leo's eyes become troubled. Swiftly he turned and looked along the edge of the desert. "See there," he said, pointing to something dim and enormous. Presently the light reached it also. It was a mighty mountain not more than 10 miles away, that stood out by itself among the sands. Then he turned once more and with his back to the desert stared at the slope of the hills, along the base of which we had been travelling. As yet they were in gloom, for the sun was behind them, but presently light began to flow over their crests like a flood. Down it crept, lower and yet lower, till it reached a little plateau not 300 yards above us. There, on the edge of the plateau, looking out solemnly across the waste,